The second half of the 6th century was not a good time politically for the Greeks of Ionia. Most of them were subjugated by the Persians, who also conquered the kingdom of Lydia. However, the island polis of Samos did quite well during this period under its daring leader, the tyrant Polykrates. In this video, I'd like to look at Samos with a special focus on the era of Polykrates. I'd like to talk about the institutions of the city, the history, and also some of the major archaeological finds that are present there. I would also like to discuss things like coins, ships, and other facets of Samian life which made Samos a major power for about 20 or 30 years in the Eastern Aegean. So without any further ado, let's get going. One of the keys to Samos' success was its geography. Samos is a large island located just off the coast of Anatolia, and while it is located near other Ionian Greek cities in the region, including Ephesus and Miletus, both of which have become more famous due to later events, especially the rise of Christianity, Samos during the Archaic period was one of the major players and was completely on par with Miletus or Ephesus. At some point early on, perhaps as early as the 8th century, but certainly no later than the 7th century, the town of Samos on the eastern side of the island was able to establish its political identity and dominance over the entire island in a process known as synoikism. This often happened in other Greek polis. One famous example is Athens imposing its identity over all of Attica. Another is the Spartan conquest of Laconia. So by the time we get to the recorded history of Samos, the entire island was Samos and the capital city was also Samos. The people on the island were all Samians. Samos was a natural center of trade, and it established strong links especially with Egypt, and as we'll see, Egypt played a strong role in Samos' development and in its ultimate political demise. Here is a modern detailed map of Samos. As you can see, the island is mostly mountainous and there aren't very many settlements on the island as a whole. The town of Samos itself is on the eastern side of the island, as I mentioned earlier. You can also see that there are a number of natural harbors to be found. The prominent one, of course, being the one in the northeastern part of the island right near the city. It should come as no surprise that this was the area which would see almost all of the monumental architecture of Samos during the Archaic period. And as I mentioned earlier, Samos is incredibly close to the coast of Anatolia. You see on the map, if you look at the southeast of the island, that it is probably within swimming distance if you are a fairly strong swimmer. The primary focus of this video is Samos during the Archaic and Classical periods, so I'd like to establish a basic chronology from a Samian point of view. Samos and Miletus, one of its nearby Ionian Greek neighbors, were bitter rivals and foes all the way down to about 560 or so BCE. The two of them competed in war and for trade. For the most part, it appears that Miletus got the better of its island neighbor, but in 560 all of that changed when the kingdom of Lydia under the leadership of Croesus was able to subdue the Ionian Greeks, at least on the mainland. So Miletus fell under the yoke of a foreign king, whereas Samos was free to continue to prosper and really do well for itself. Samos reached its peak from approximately 570 or so, when, as we'll see, they were able to engage in large-scale monumental building, and this peak will continue down to about 520 or so, which marks the death of Polykrates and the slide of Samos into the political orbit of Persia as a kind of satellite state. Polykrates' tyranny itself, which is the key focus of this video in terms of the political history involved, went from about the 540s, we're not sure exactly when Polykrates came to power, down until 522 or so, which is around the time that he died. Polykrates' descendants were then able to keep the tyranny going under Persian protection until the Athenians, victorious in the Persian War, were sweeping east and forming the Delian League. At this time, the Samians overthrew their last tyrant and joined the Delian League. However, the Delian League was not completely open with its members, and it slowly started to transform into an Athenian empire. So, around 440 or so, the Samians revolted from Athens. We'll get into a few more of the details later. And this led to an outright Athenian conquest of the island and the settlement of so-called klerouks. A klerouk is an Athenian who is settled in a foreign land but retains his citizenship and pays taxes to Athens. Normally, when polis would dispatch colonies, those colonies would become their own polity and they would become politically independent. But in the case of Athens, it rarely used colonization, but rather would establish kleroukies. These plots of land were taken from locals and then given to Athenian citizens, mostly poor men who did not have much land of their own back in Attica. There was an Athenian oligarchic coup in 411, but the Athenian fleet, which contained many of the poorer citizens, happened to be stationed at Samos, and effectively the democracy in exile would function from Samos during that period of tense negotiation between the fleet at Samos and the oligarchs back at Athens. Ultimately, Athens was reunified without violence, and for the part that they played, the Samians were rewarded, and their friendship with Athens deepened because of it. The klerouks were able to remain in Samos almost uninterrupted, despite many setbacks that the Athenians suffered in subsequent years. However, the last of the Athenian klerouks were sent home in the 330s following the final victory of Philip II at the Battle of Chaeronea. And this meant that all of these klerouks had to return to the city to which they belonged, Athens. But as we'll see, there was at least one young man who had spent his entire life, or at least the vast majority of it, in Samos, and then when he got to Athens, perhaps he felt a little out of place, and this led him to take a very specific and peculiar view on life, which he then turned into a school of philosophy. By the 7th century at the latest, Samian society had come to be dominated by an aristocracy which was called the Geomoroi. Why they had this name, we don't quite know. Like many aristocracies in the Greek world, the Geomoroi were very jealous of their privileges and prerogatives, and therefore they resisted all attempts by the newly wealthy and middling farmers to assert their political rights. The growing unpopularity of this aristocracy would then allow one of the families of that aristocracy to establish a tyranny during the early 6th century. This is quite in keeping with what we see in a number of other Greek polis. It seems that a lot of the places where tyrannies were established were fairly large and prosperous cities, which happened to have a good amount of maritime trade. Make of that what you will. Unlike some earlier generations of scholars, we now know that while many tyrants went on to become very prominent in international Greek affairs, tyrannies were the exception and not the rule. And as I said, it was mostly only the major maritime powers like Corinth and Athens which ended up producing tyrants. Samos, of course, would produce the house which would eventually give us Polykrates, so they too are part of that tradition. But by and large, we have very little evidence of most other polis having a tyrannical phase. Throughout the Greek world, local elites would claim that they were superior to their neighbors, and they would use a number of means to make that claim. One common one was to claim descent from a god or hero, which would then make one's own family a superior line when compared to an unknown family of some poor farmer. Another way on a daily basis that aristocrats could show their superiority and their claim to power would be to engage in what is known as aristocratic display. This is when local elites like the Geomoroi of Samos would engage in conspicuous consumption in order to show off their wealth, power, and their generosity. The generosity part comes in when they would, say, hand out meat from a sacrifice or provide extra places at dinner for people who could not afford such extravagant meals on their own dime. For the most part, however, these aristocracies tended to be rather inward-looking and closed off. As I mentioned earlier, when people would make money and become newly rich, there would be tension with the established aristocrats because the aristocrats did claim their status not from their wealth, but rather from their birth. As for how young aristocrats continued to carry on the traditions of their families, they needed to show off that they were in fact better than their poorer peers. Young aristocrats often competed as athletes, exercised publicly in the gymnasium. In fact, the real purpose of this was to show off their prowess. Or, during battles, they would fight in the front ranks with fancy armor in order to show that they were the best warriors and that they were deserving of their place in the world. And in fact, while some progress was made on the issue over time, throughout pretty much all of Greek history, the overwhelming majority of the athletes who would go on to compete at the Olympic Games, the Nemean Games, and other great athletic contests would be young aristocrats trying to burnish the image of their family. Another feature of Greek political life that we see on display in Samos and elsewhere is that one way that people sought to fight aristocratic dominance was to curb aristocratic display. What were known as sumptuary laws were passed where aristocratic activities would be regulated. These could be things like not allowing them to meet after a certain time at a public place, or putting a limit on how much money they could spend for, say, a funeral for a family member. And when we get to the family of Polykrates and his predecessors, we see that they are very concerned to limit what other aristocratic clans can do because they don't want to be outshone. So that is how aristocratic culture worked. And in Samos, another effect of this is that the city would become a cultural center, since it was known for being more of a party town for the rich than many of its neighbors. Unfortunately, we don't really know most of the details of archaic Samian history. We don't know, for instance, the exact contours of the political conflict between the Geomoroi and its enemies, or if perhaps the conflict was amongst the Geomoroi. At any rate, whatever the conflict was, Silason I became tyrant by the 590s. Coincidentally, Athens during the 590s also had its fair share of internal disturbances, and this led to the appointment of Solon as lawgiver. Silason was the tyrant of the island polis of Samos from the 590s down until his death around 560, when he was succeeded by his son Iakes. Iakes in turn ruled until perhaps 550 or the early 540s. At that time, the Geomoroi decided that they were tired of the house of Silason, so they refused to allow Polykrates to take his father's place, and instead reinstated rule by the aristocracy as a whole. It appears that Polykrates' house of Silason remained in good standing in the new order, however, since by all accounts he was still on the island and still engaging in aristocratic display with the best of them. However, later on, of course, Polykrates will seize power, but we'll get there when we get there. After Polykrates' death, he was then succeeded by his brother Silason II, who did not rule very long. Silason II was succeeded by his son Iakes II, but Iakes II was deposed by the Ionian Revolt, then restored in 494. Later on, of course, the Athenians would come in and Samos would join the Delian League, thus expelling the last of the rulers from the house of Silason. While Polykrates was out of power, the Persians struck Ionia, and it would appear that the Samian people became fearful, and they desired a strong leader to emerge and keep them safe from Persian aggression. Polykrates thought that he was just the man for the job. Getting together with 15 men dressed in hoplite armor, Polykrates simply strode into the heart of Samos and declared the rule of the Geomoroi over, and his tyranny began. Quite an uneventful beginning, but that is how coups work sometimes. Later on, one Persian satrap would mock another for not stopping this coup, but if Herodotus's recounting of how the coup went down is at all accurate, it's unclear how the Persians could have either predicted or prevented such a thing from occurring. Polykrates, although he was a third-generation tyrant, had to do some things to continue to develop his legitimacy, and two of his favorite tactics for giving people a reason to continue supporting him were that he was a great builder and he was also a patron of the arts. I suspect his patronage of the arts was designed to endear him with the members of the Geomoroi, who otherwise would have been quite discontent having their political rights trampled upon by another dictator from the House of Silasson. The core of Polykrates' power, however, came from his military strength and ability. He had a fleet of 100 pentaconter warships constructed. I'm sure that some of them existed before for the Samians, but Polykrates enlarged the fleet to 100 full ships, and he also employed a standing force of 1,000 citizen archers. These men were useful both on the pentaconters and on land. The pentaconter is basically the precursor of the trireme. It was a 50-oared warship, and during the 6th century it was the standard Greek design. Since it was not as heavy as the trireme, it did not really utilize the ramming tactics that the Athenian triremes used later on, and mostly relied on boarding actions or on fire from archers. The reason why the pentaconter was preferred even after the invention of the trireme, at least for a time, is the simple problem of paying large groups of men that you need to keep triremes manned and operational. Triremes have 200 rowers. A pentaconter, as the name implies, only have 50. So you can have a much larger and more sustainable fleet using pentaconters than you can with triremes. It's also worth mentioning that triremes are much more top-heavy and subject to being destroyed in storms, whereas pentaconters are a good deal more practicable for getting around and staying afloat. As the other Ionians fell under the yoke of Persia from the 540s on, Polykrates was able to successfully maintain his independence. He used his fleet to raid and engage in piracy. He did this both against other Greeks and against the Persians. Now, as you might imagine, the Persians did not take kindly to this, and they turned to their subjects, the Phoenicians, who were also excellent sailors, and deployed the Phoenician fleet to threaten Polykrates. Duly impressed with Phoenician power, Polykrates promised to stop raiding Persian territory, and therefore only raided his fellow Greeks. The Greeks were not as wealthy as the Persians and Greeks under Persian control, so the amount of booty that Polykrates was bringing in began to dwindle, and this made it increasingly difficult to engage in munificence or to keep paying his soldiers and sailors. Speaking of the need to pay soldiers and sailors, this more than any other factor drove the monetization of the Greek world. By the end of the 6th century, it was standard that a polis had to pay its soldiers and sailors to retain their services. Payments in kind simply wouldn't do anymore. So what we see is that Polykrates, who employed a large standing army, needed more coinage, therefore he minted more of it, and this led to larger scale monetization. We can really see that by looking at the coinage before and after Polykrates' time. Before Polykrates, most coins were high denomination and were only used for capital purchases. This could be anything from buying a ship from a foreign power to investing in building a great temple complex like the Hera. Before Polykrates, Samos used electrum as the standard metal for its coins. Electrum, which is a blend of gold and silver which occurs naturally, came from nearby mines in the kingdom of Lydia, and this was what they would work with since they could get electrum from their neighbor. However, after the fall of Lydia to the Persians, the Samians began to mint in silver. Silver would then become a standard for the Greek world, since the Greek world doesn't have much gold, but it had a decent amount of silver. Samos was an important waypoint for a very long time for Lydian, Phoenician, and Egyptian goods on their way to mainland Greece, and its main sort of product that it dealt in was perfume and cosmetics. Samos was the gateway for Lydian cosmetics to mainland Greece, where aristocratic men and women would consume these luxury items at a high cost. So Samos was making a lot of money, but this didn't necessarily mean that they had it all in coin. And despite this high volume of trade, Samos during the 6th century was at no time anywhere close to being a fully cash economy. Many poor Samians most likely never had a coin of any kind, and they would have paid their rent in kind with agricultural goods, or they would have engaged in bartering when they visited town to deal with merchants. If we look at the period between about 570 all the way until Polykrates' rise around 540, or the years immediately before, we see that no new coins were minted for that entire period. When he began to mint more Samian coinage around 525, Polykrates decided to abandon the old weights and measures that Samos had used in the past and instead adopt the internationally recognized standards of the former Lydian kingdom and their competitors, the city of Miletus. This meant that these coins would be more attractive to, say, skilled craftsmen who might visit Polykrates' island to build something, or mercenaries who may otherwise be hired by Persia or another Greek power. These coins, despite being from Samos and minted by the authority of Polykrates, would be acceptable in almost any market since they were now standardized and comparable to what one might find already in the marketplace. However, even though this did very much increase the availability of funds for most people, the smallest denomination available was the trihemiobol, which would be worth approximately half of a drachma, or 3 obols. So that means that this would be about half a day's wage for a skilled laborer during the 5th century in Athens. Since inflation in the ancient world was a very, very slow process and sometimes didn't take place for centuries, it's fairly safe to assume that an obol in the 6th century in Samos had about the same purchasing power as an obol in Athens 50 years later. This means that, unlike in Athens, where a single obol could buy, say, a loaf of bread, which was enough to feed a single man for the day, that for the most part, Samians would not be making daily food purchases with the coinage that was available. The trihemiobol was simply too valuable to spend on something like that, since there was no smaller denomination below it. So, despite increasing the amount of cash in the economy and making more cash transactions in the economy, Polykrates' coinage did not transfer Samos away from the barter system on a daily basis. We also see some economic changes later in Polykrates' reign. There's less evidence of the importation of luxury items under Polycrates because by this point, the Samians themselves were developing domestic industries and producing their own luxury items for export. And to reemphasize, despite the fact that there is what we would call today economic growth, industrialization, and also more coinage, Samos was at heart still primarily agricultural and non-cash based. Polycrates seems to have enjoyed a relationship with a number of monarchs and tyrants around the Aegean, but the ruler who had the most impact on Polycrates' life and also the life of Samos was without a doubt the contemporary pharaoh of Egypt, Amasis II. By this point, Egypt was in what is known as the late period. It had fallen a long way from the glory and power of the new kingdom, but Egypt still held a strong place in the Greek cultural imagination. The pyramids were stunning to them, and contemporary Egyptian temples, which were in operation, were on a much grander scale than anything that the Greeks had built up to that point. For the Egyptians, the main resource that the Greeks had to offer were mercenary hoplites. And in Ionia, due to the intervention of the Persians in local Greek affairs, there were a lot of exiles who were serving as mercenaries in Egypt under Amasis. The primary conduit for such people to Egypt was through Samos, the last great bastion of Ionian freedom, so tantalizingly close to the coast of the Persian Empire. By the time of Cambyses' invasion of Egypt in 525, however, Polycrates knew that for all of his supposed friendship with Amasis, that he could ill afford to offend Persia. So instead of standing by his longtime friend, Polycrates instead sided with Cambyses and sent 40 warships to aid the Persian invasion of Egypt. According to Herodotus, a disproportionate number of the men on board those ships were his political opponents. His hope was that they would be out of his hair because they were out of town, and maybe if he got lucky, they would die of a disease or in battle. But that's not quite the way that things ended up working out for Polycrates, as we'll see. And while this is the most accurate and plausible form of the story, it might not be the most interesting. Not all of Herodotus's observations were historical in nature. Quite a few of them were somewhat like a fable in the sense that they would try to impart some kind of moral lesson. And Herodotus did something like this in his account of Polycrates, just as he had done with the former ruler of Lydia, Croesus. Polycrates had a favorite object according to Herodotus, and this was a ring that had been cast by the great Samian sculptor Theodorus. Polycrates wore this with him everywhere and showed it off to everyone he met. In Egypt, the wise pharaoh Amasis was supposedly deeply concerned with the pride and continuous good fortune of Polycrates. He thought that the gods surely would not bless Polycrates so greatly for so long without smiting him and giving him a reversal of fortune which would balance out his life. Polycrates had no such fears, so what he decided to do was to make a token act which would then convince Amasis that the two of them should continue on as friends. In order to establish that sometimes bad things did happen to him, Polycrates removed his ring and threw it into the sea. And then he had this reported to Amasis, who would then hopefully believe that, well, Polycrates' life wasn't perfect and things sometimes went against him. However, Polycrates once again got lucky. A few days later, a fisherman brought in his haul, and when he was cutting open the fish, he happened to find the ring that Polycrates had so famously lost. He then returned the ring. When Amasis heard about this ring being recovered and restored to its rightful owner, he panicked because then he knew that the gods really did have it in for Polykrates, and therefore he broke off their relationship. So later on, when Polykrates declared war and sent 40 ships to aid the Persians, he was not actually betraying a friend. Of course, this story is deeply implausible, but it is interesting, and this is one of the reasons why Herodotus is always a great read and always worth your time. As I mentioned above, Polykrates thought it would be a good idea to send all of his political opponents with the expedition to Egypt. In the event, this did not turn out to be a wise decision. Somehow or other, these men, who were aristocrats with wide-ranging contacts throughout the Greek world, managed to escape, and then they went to mainland Greece, where they had connections. They found their Zenoi receptive at both Corinth and Sparta to sending aid to overthrow the tyrant Polykrates and restore the Geomoroi to their rightful place in the world. This would mark the first time, by the way, that Sparta deployed troops outside of mainland Greece. For Corinth, a major naval power, this was not as unusual, but to the best of my knowledge, it was the first time that the Corinthians dispatched military forces in order to honor their Xenia. This expedition set out from Greece, and while the Spartan, Corinthian, and Samian exile force did manage to defeat Polykrates in the field outside of Samos, the subsequent siege failed. The Samian citizens seem to have been content with Polykrates by and large, and the oligarchic faction which had tried to bring in foreign aid to overthrow him seems to have still remained unpopular. Siege warfare in the Archaic and Classical period was also notoriously difficult. Most cities only fell due to treachery. And while Sparta was masterful at hoplite warfare, they were outright incompetent when it came to siege warfare. So the Samians held out, and the expedition was forced to return to mainland Greece with very little to show for their efforts. However, soon after this, Polykrates died, presumably of natural causes, and he was succeeded by his brother. Internationally, Samos owed its fame to its trade, its fleet, its flamboyant tyrant Polykrates, and also to the Heraion, a major cultural and religious center for the Ionians. However, the most technically impressive thing that the Samians accomplished during the Archaic period was without a doubt Eupalinus' tunnel. Eupalinus was a prominent Samian engineer who was also renowned internationally, and he developed an underground water system during or possibly slightly before the time of Polykrates. Eupalinus' tunnel was designed in no small part to keep the city of Samos with fresh water in the event of a siege, and also possibly was built to deal with population growth to make sure that the city was abundantly supplied with water as it continued to grow and prosper. I have to imagine that there were a fair number of refugees from Ionia who tried to settle in Samos. This tunnel took an incredible amount of work to complete, and Eupalinus had men on the job for around 10 years before this tunnel was finally finished. The tunnel was well built, and it continued to provide water to the citizens of Samos all the way until Byzantine times. Hera, the queen of the gods and consort/sister of Zeus, was the patron deity of Samos. A large temple complex to Hera, known as the Hecatompedon, was built in the mid-7th century and would remain largely unchanged for about 75 years. However, as the wealth and technical skills of the Greeks increased over time, they began to build larger, grander structures for their religious activities, and it became a point of pride between rival communities to have bigger and better temples than one's neighbors. After 75 years of the Hecatompedon, the Samians decided that it was time for an upgrade. The altar was enlarged in the early 6th century, and then toward the middle of the 6th century, the South Stoa was added, and the second Hecatompadon temple was demolished in favor of a new temple, and also some additional outlying structures that you can see on the map there. As for this new temple that would replace the Hecatompadon, this is a temple known as Ricus's temple, and some of it still remains today. Ricus's temple was built by the famous Samian architect Ricus, an older contemporary of Polykrates. Ricus seems to have been heavily inspired by Egyptian temples, and most likely he visited those temples himself and took careful note of their features. Just like Eupalinus' temple, most modern scholars estimate that Ricus's temple would have taken around a full decade to construct, and most likely that decade stretched from 570 to about 560 BCE. Ricus's temple really raised Samos's profile among the Ionians. And after this temple was erected and visitors started to pour in, other cities such as Miletus and Ephesus realized that they needed to up their game and build grander temples that were of a more advanced and sophisticated design if they wanted to avoid being outshone by their longtime rival on the island of Samos. And fun side note, it is typically believed that Ricus is the father of Theodorus, the guy who designed the ring that Polykrates wore so proudly. Earlier we mentioned aristocratic display. One of the major ways that elites like to convey their eliteness was to hold symposia and show off their level of culture. What better way to do that than by sponsoring great poets? Samos produced a good number of these poets, and what they couldn't produce they could import, as they did with cosmetics from Lydia. Many of these poets were sponsored by Polykrates or his father, and there were probably other lesser-known poets who were sponsored by different members of the Geomoroi. Being a great patron of the arts, as I mentioned, was one of the best ways for ambitious aristocrats to advertise their power and their social standing. We'll look at 3 of these poets along with fragments of their work. Thankfully, the scholar Graham Shipley has assembled many of these fragments in his great monograph on the subject of the city of Samos. And I'm following his translations of the poetic fragments, by the way. First up is the poet Asius, who mostly specialized in epic. According to later sources who still had access to some of his poetry, his epic was dreadful and he didn't really understand how to describe action. However, he did know how to write for the occasion of the symposium, at least a little bit. And he also knew how to write when it came to describing the rituals surrounding the festival of Hera. Here's a fragment from Asius describing aristocratic women during a festival of Hera. And they too, when they had combed their flowing locks, used to go to Hera's precinct, all bound in fine robes. Their snow-white tunics used to reach to the floor of the broad earth, with golden brooches shaped like grasshoppers on them. Their tresses waved in the wind in golden bands, and cunningly worked bracelets were about their arms. So far as I'm aware, this is almost the only fragment of any of his writing, which is more than we can say for a lot of Greek authors, unfortunately. Another major poet who visited Samos during the 6th century was Ibycus, who was something of the official court poet late in the reign of Iacches I, Polykrates' father. During Ibycus' time, Polykrates was the young heir apparent, and Ibycus did what he could to butter up the future tyrant by writing an encomium about his virtues. For the most part, Ibycus' content was secular in nature, and for the most part, the only things that he was interested in were secular topics such as love and lust. Here is one such fragment of his work. But for me, love sleeps at no season. Like the north wind from Thrace, aflame with the lightning, it comes with a rush from the Cyprian goddess, dark and shameless with shriveling madness, and mightily makes my heart tremble from its roots. Last but not least was Polycrates' tutor, the poet Anacreon, also a native of Samos. While Anacreon was the court poet of Polycrates, he did not write about very serious subjects, and this reflects the taste of Polycrates, who liked to keep it light and witty. It should come as no surprise, I think, that someone who was working against the political interest and freedom of the Geomoroi, their freedom to, of course, be a narrow aristocracy, Polycrates had no interest in discussing higher ideals of politics or great deeds of glory. So he preferred that his poets talk about sex and drinking. And Anacreon was more than happy to oblige. Here is a fragment of Anacreon's work. Once more, golden-haired Eros hurls his purple ball at me, challenging me to play with the girl in colored sandals. But she's from well-built Lesbos, and she despises my hair because it is white, and gapes after some other girl. Boy with the look of a maid, I pursue you, but you ignore me, not knowing you are the charioteer of my soul. It's also worth noting that so far as we can tell, Polycrates preferred men to women, but Anacreon here seems to be making the boy an afterthought, and his real interest was the girl with the colored sandals. At any rate, though, Polycrates was able to appreciate a good poem about being horny, and his old tutor knew what buttons to press to make the poem acceptable to his paymaster. Whatever its many political setbacks and challenges, 6th century Ionia did enjoy a vibrant intellectual culture. It was, I think, one of the most brilliant periods of human activity. During this time, early Greek philosophers were interested in literally any subject. Philosophy means the love of knowledge, and the early philosophers certainly did not impose any disciplinary boundaries on their interest. Much of what they were interested in is what we would today categorize as natural science. They were interested in how the world worked, and in subjects ranging from astronomy to mathematics to ethics. Later on, in the classical period, Plato and Aristotle would more or less seal philosophy as the study of the human condition and ethics, and really reduce its scope quite a bit. However, during the 6th century, philosophy was still completely and totally wide open, and it was a pretty exciting time to be an intellectual, I have to think. For the most part, these thinkers came from places like Miletus. Miletus, the great rival of Samos during this time, produced the natural philosophers Anaximander, Anaximenes, and the first historian, yes, prior to Herodotus, Hecataeus. Herodotus himself was not all that much later, and he of course also hailed from this general region from the city of Halicarnassus, which, while it was not technically Ionian, was pretty damn close to it. Samos, for its part, did produce one great intellectual during this period who we would still consider a philosopher today, and that individual is someone you learned about in high school math. His name is Pythagoras. Pythagoras seems to have been somewhat close to Polycrates in age. Today, Pythagoras is primarily known for his work in mathematics and for the Pythagorean theorem. However, in his own time, he was much more famous as a philosopher, and also, to put it simply, as something of a cult leader. Pythagoras had a very specific view of how one should live one's life, and he tried to inculcate this to his followers by starting an ascetic community in South Italy at Croton. He taught his followers to abstain from eating meat. They were not necessarily full-on vegetarians, but they did try to avoid eating meat as much as possible. He also taught that the soul was immortal, and many later philosophers will make vague references back to Pythagoras when they talk about the soul, so it is possible that he was more or less the father of this belief among the ancient Greeks. He's the source for Plato's ideas about the soul, or at least he heavily influenced Plato's ideas, since Plato brings him up quite a bit. It also appears that Pythagoras may have been the father of numerology. This may not have been a thing before him. Numerology is reading in special meanings to numbers, i.e. the idea that 7 is a lucky number. Pythagoras, despite being a man of reason and an extremely intelligent guy who was interested in mathematics, also had a lot of irrational interests, numerology just being one of them. It also appears that he was greatly interested in all aspects of mysticism and astrology. So as I mentioned earlier, and it bears repeating now, there were no disciplinary boundaries in 6th century Ionia, and Pythagoras is perhaps the greatest example of that, since his interest ranged the entire possible gamut for someone living at that time. By and large, I've chosen to not talk about Samos's history after Polycrates, since it isn't terribly interesting, to put it quite bluntly. During the 5th century, Samos was under the shadow of Athens pretty much the whole century. In 479, the Samians joined the Delian League in order to get revenge against Persia. They thought that they were trading in the Persian yoke for freedom, when in reality they were simply taking on the Athenian yoke. In 440, the Samians learned this beyond any shadow of a doubt. It is worth noting that our account of this war comes from Athens, and they call it the Samian War. This conflict began because Samos and Miletus, both of which were subject cities to Athens, were fighting one another, and when Athens ordered them to cease hostilities, Samos refused, thinking that they were an independent and powerful ally of Athens and they need not respond to commands. Athens under Pericles, however, viewed it differently, and therefore declared war on Samos and sent a fleet to lay siege. After a long and very expensive siege, Pericles was able to capture Samos and thereby make it a purely tributary ally without much of a fleet of its own. Before, the Samians had mostly contributed ships in the form of triremes, but now they would be forced to pay money, and they would lose most of their independence at home. During this time, Pericles decided that Samos was too strategically important and too powerful to leave ungarrisoned, so he imposed Athenian clerics on the island. These settlers, as I mentioned earlier, were Athenian citizens who continued to serve as Athenian citizens. They did not join the Samian polity such as it was, and they were explicitly there to farm the land, collect tribute from the land, and also to serve as something of an unofficial garrison to keep the locals in line. I also mentioned earlier that during the revolution of 411, where the oligarchs in Athens itself overthrew the government and tried to make peace with Persia and Sparta, that most of the fleet was in Samos, and they basically declared themselves to be the democracy in exile. Samians who were serving with the fleet in large numbers and supported the restoration of Athenian democracy were somewhat honored, and Samos became much more honored among the Athenians in general for its role in helping to resolve the crisis of 411. The Athenian clerics seem to have remained despite the defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, and in fact it was not until 322 BCE, following the Athenian defeat in the Samian War at the hands of the regent Antipater, that all of the remaining clerics were sent home. Earlier, I think I said that this occurred during the time of Philip II of Macedon after Chaeronea, but if I said that, then I misspoke. The clerics were not removed until 322, And the reason I know that is because there was one very famous Clerook who emerged at the end of the period of the Cleruches on Samos. While he isn't technically Samian, Epicurus of Athens was in fact born on Samos and lived there continuously until his 18th birthday, when he moved to Attica in order to undergo his ephebate. It was during his time of military service when the Samian War was fought and lost. Most likely Epicurus participated in that war, and then his family was uprooted from Samos and relocated to Athens. Despite the fact that Clerooks were normally not fabulously wealthy, Epicurus's family was pretty well off, and he certainly had enough money to get involved in politics were he so inclined. The reason I point this out is because even though Athens was democratic during most of the 5th and 4th centuries, you still had to have a lot of money to have the leisure to actually do politics. Also, right after the fall of Athens in 322, it was oligarchic for a fairly long period of time. However, by the time that Epicurus was reaching his prime, Athens would be democratic once again, at least for a while, starting around 286 or so. But Epicurus took no interest in politics. I can't help but wonder if perhaps he thought of himself a little bit more as a Samian than as an Athenian, since that was in fact his home. But nonetheless, Epicurus was not interested in politics. He thought that it had too many vicissitudes and unknowns. For him, happiness lay elsewhere. Epicurus, over time, developed a philosophy which later became one of the major schools of philosophy to emerge from the Hellenistic period. His philosophy, or at least the core of it, is known as the hedonistic calculus. This is often misrepresented as people who are hedonistic trying their best to maximize their pleasure in terms of sex, drugs, and drinking. But Epicurus's idea of what hedonistic calculus was effectively maximizing the good things in life and minimizing the bad. He left it deliberately vague because he knew that good and bad are very much subjective qualities. What may be good to one person might not be pleasurable for another. So for some people, maximizing the amount of partying that they do would be the best way to seek happiness. However, for other people, this would be miserable, especially someone who's, say, introverted. So for them, a different lifestyle would be preferable. Epicurus was all about maximizing one's personal well-being. His worldview was inherently materialistic. He also talked about things like atomism. He seems to have picked up where Democritus left off in that regard. But his worldview was not quite atheistic, despite what his later detractors claimed. He did not believe the gods had much of a role to play in our lives, but rather saw them as paragons of virtue that people should look to and emulate to the best of their abilities. One interesting thing about the Epicurean school is that it was open to women from the time of Epicurus forward. He thought that women could benefit from his teachings every bit as much as men, and he also believed that women were capable of reason and that they could become philosophers. His views were quite ahead of their time, as it didn't become very common for women to learn about philosophy in large numbers until the later Hellenistic period, and also in the Roman period with figures like Hypatia of Alexandria. And while we normally think of Epicurus as seeking the balance on hedonistic calculus or seeking happiness, the actual word in Greek is ataraxia, which best translates as tranquility. The idea here being that it is more important to avoid trouble and the things which bring you displeasure than it is to seek the things which do bring you pleasure. However, while Epicurus had a strong distaste for politics, he did recognize that as someone with a considerable fortune, he was expected to pay his fair share in taxes, so to avoid inspiring the ire of officials, he would always do whatever duties were asked of him by the public, but no more. He tried to do what he needed to do in order to maximize the free time he had to devote to the things which did bring him pleasure in life. And for Epicurus, there was no greater pleasure than simply spending time with his friends discussing philosophy and literature. That for him was the best way to live his life. As much as I admire Epicurus and his teachings, the fact is that it would have been sad to end on an Athenian who happened to be born on Samos rather than a native son of Samos itself. Fortunately for us, Samos did produce one more famous son during the Hellenistic period, and that gentleman was named Aristarchus. Despite the fact that he is hardly a household name today, and that his teachings were not accepted as the orthodoxy in the scientific community until a couple millennia after his death, Aristarchus was perhaps one of the greatest minds that Samos ever produced. He was an astronomer and mathematician who lived during the early Hellenistic period. Perhaps he lived to be approximately 80 years old if he was born around 310 and died around 230. Aristarchus observed the heavens, and rather than conclude that the earth was the center of the universe, which is what most of his contemporaries concluded, both the ones who were intellectuals and the ones who were just average people looking up at the stars at night, Aristarchus instead proposed that the sun must be the center of the universe. We would today call it the solar system, but Aristarchus and his contemporaries thought of it as the universe. Aristarchus was able to attract a few followers in antiquity, including some people who came several generations after him, but for the most part, the geocentric model that was preferred by Aristotle and by Ptolemy of Alexandria remained almost unchallenged until Copernicus in the early 16th century. Aristarchus was many, many centuries ahead of his time, and I think it's fitting that Samos, which was once known for its culture, ended on such a high note. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.